If I consider Advaita in this light, because I also wanted to add a little bit from the Trika perspective, so switching the other side of the same coin, rather than going from the perspective of a pure description of the absolute, I would go now from the perspective of the manifold, from the world, from the joy, the fun, our everyday life, our being in the world, our relations in the world, our devotion, our practices, our sadhana. But then, aren't they contradictory? We want a narrative, and then it has to fit in our narrative, because, okay, that is one thing, as if Vedanta described like a picture, and then we want to compare it with something else. And when I say no, Vedanta just is the truth, the absolute as such, and then now people would ask, but then Trika system, if they either it has to be identical to Vedanta, or then if it is not identical, then it has to be false, because how can it be, or there must be two different truths. My response is, from the perspective of the absolute, a pure description of the absolute, Advaita does its job of giving this singularity of the Brahman. From the perspective, it's like a coin having two sides. From the perspective of the world, the manifold, the relations, and sadhana, from the perspective of a practice, Trika Siddhanta gives a path. We want the Vedanta to be the path. But what if Vedanta is the goal? If Vedanta is the absolute? But we want it to be the both. Then call that whole thing Vedanta. It's all right. So for me, this Trika perspective is simply a reiteration of the same absolute from the perspective of the manifold, from the perspective of the words and the meaning, from the perspective of the bubbles or the waves, like you are not the ocean, but seeing from outside, and then the manifold appears. When you are describing from outside, in the manifold appears then. What would it be like? In that Trika perspective, what would be the nature of the absolute then? It's still the same singularity, but then it is vibrant, it's spontaneous, it's free or autonomous, and it's dynamic. And it's in its dynamism, what it does is it constitutes the manifold. It becomes many. Tad ekshata bahusyam prajaye. Ekoham bahusyam. It's in the Upanishads. It assumes the manifold. Assuming is not in the false projection here. It's becoming. It becomes many. How can it be many? Because it can. That is, can is the Shakti. Can is the power. And that power is not something distinct from this very absolute. Just like my energy to come and speak in front of you is not separate from me, or my energy to run or walk or play, not separate from me, my very expression in such and so forms, this very absolute to manifold in the forms of the God and the world and the subjects, the triadic manifestation, or as separating itself, its own consciousness, reflecting back, separating that reflecting mode from the illumination, separating vimarsha from prakasha. and rejoicing bliss as enjoyer, as subject, as agent, and having actions as real, assuming the manifold as they appear. That to me would be a Trika description of the absolute. From this perspective, this spontaneity is intrinsic, inherent nature of being and not separated from the being. And actually, this spontaneity is not something as belonging to the being. It is the very being. All that exists is this very spontaneity. Ramakrishna knew that better. That is why he worshipped Kali. Forget all these descriptions. Surrender to the mother. He would say, in her dynamism, in her expression, what is she? Kali, the time. And what is Kali? That time is Swatantra Shakti. There is no difference between spontaneity and temporality. Freedom itself expresses in the form of time. That foundational being manifests in terms of time, and that time unfolds itself in terms of space, and different agencies appear, and then we run our life. What this perspective does is it gives a different sense for the manifold. Every leaf of a single tree is unique, and there never is an exact duplication of anything in nature's creation. We all are unique, even in our physical composition and also in our mind. That is why it is called pratibha. The same spontaneity that is called Kali is also called pratibha, which is also, you can call, creativity or intuitive power inherent to being. And this pratibha is timeless and never ever ceasing to be. Therefore, the dynamism is constantly appearing, manifesting, appearing here not in the illusory sense, but appearing in the absolute real sense to become many.